Let's turn to Romans 14 Unplugged, Feast and Fast and Food. Oh my. We're in Romans 14 and we're nearly done with this particular study. We will finish this year. We left off in verses 20 and 21, as you can see on my screen right now. We're talking really about this topic of food, which is Paul's main topic in this particular section of his letter as well. And so let's read the two verses for study and then we'll read my comments. Over on the left side of the screen, you can see the ESV version of my Bible that I've got pulled up, and then I've got the SBLG&T Greek on the right side. I'll read that as well. Paul says over here on the left side, he says in verse 20, "Do not for the sake of food destroy the work of God. Everything is indeed clean, but it is wrong for anyone to make another stumble by what he eats." And then in verse 21, he says, "It is good," sorry about that. He says, "It is good not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything that causes your brother to stumble." Give me a second. Do I want to blow that up? Yeah, I think I do. I want to get really radical there. Give me a second. All right. So those are the verses that we're going to be looking at. Paul is addressing food issues, and he's addressing really table fellowship issues all throughout this particular chapter of the letter. Let me go back and read the Greek for us real quick, and then we'll jump into the study. Verse 20 says, Me eneken bromatas katalua to ergan tu theu panta men kathara ala kakan to anthropo dia praskamatas esthianti. And then verse 20 right there says, Kalan to me fagen krea meda pien. Wow, I'm stumbling over the Greek tonight. Pien oinon made in ho ha adelpha su proskapte, and then we have in brackets a little variant that shows up in some versions, some don't show this. But it says a scandalizetai a astene, and that'll be the end of the bracketing section and the end of verse 21 for our just the reading of the verses. All right, let's drop down through the notes. I say in my commentary this way: when you read through my the verse that I just read, I underline the word clean. And I say in my commentary that the word I underline above in verse 20, which in your English Bibles is clean, but in the Greek, it's the Greek word katharos. And it's defined in lexicons as clean or pure or blameless or even innocent. That's an interesting word there, innocent. And what we're trying to ascertain is why Paul would opt for this word clean when he's talking about food or animals or anything like that. When he says all things are clean. Does he mean that they're ceremonially clean, right? Ritually clean? Meaning, is Paul absolutely, positively contradicting the law of Moses here? Well, I say in my commentary once more, Tim Hagg's comments on this Pauline passage are invaluable. So in his lengthy commentary to Romans, which I have quoted here for us, let me just read that quote. Let's see how long that quote is. It's not very long. We can easily navigate this tonight. Here's what Tim Hagg has to say. Tim Hagg, by the way, is a Messianic Torah teacher by today's standards, meaning he's not some bygone sage of years gone by. It's not some ancient rabbinic sage or anything like that. He's a modern Torah teacher. You can find his teachings online at TorahResource.com, and I highly recommend them. Here's what Tim Hagg says. He is a doctor, by the way. I almost said Dr. Hagg, but he doesn't go by Dr. Hagg. Even though he has a doctor's degree, he just goes by Tim Hagg. He says, the definition of clean and unclean comes from the Torah. And I think one of the reasons that Tim Hagg's mentioning that right up front is because by today's Bible teaching standards, it's easy to forget as we're reading through the Bible, particularly the New Testament, and we encounter commentaries and listen to sermons and things like that. It's easy to forget that Paul was a lifelong Torah-keeping Jew who was versed in the Old Testament. He understood what the true definitions of clean and unclean. He understood what God was trying to convey through the mouth of Moses when he read through his Torah. And so it wouldn't really be beneficial for Paul to explain a new definition of clean that was different than what God had already defined as clean. So keep that in mind, because when we're having these discussions about unclean from the Bible, and we don't go back and look at the original languages, either Hebrew or Greek, then it's easy for us to just fall back to the English that we are used to using, but not realizing that Paul wasn't speaking in English. So this will make sense a little bit later on. So Higgs says, the definition of clean and unclean comes from the Torah, not from man. Not from man. It's not man, it's not even Paul who has the right to declare what's clean and unclean. Only God has the right to declare what animals can produce clean or unclean food. Man can come along and add some additional preferences on its own. For instance, God says, I'll give you this, just a crude example, but it works. God says the meat from an animal sacrificed in ritual slaughter, such as a lamb, is clean to eat. Israel, you may eat meat sacrificed from a lamb as long as the sacrificial procedure was done correctly and the blood was drained out and things like that, and you offer the portions up to God that you're supposed to. Then the meat that is obtained from that lamb is clean. This is God's declaration. However, if a man comes along, an Israelite, this is just an example, but follow along. If an Israelite were to come along and say, well, I am a vegetarian, therefore I prefer not to eat meat, God doesn't seem to have a problem with that. Your preference for vegetarianism doesn't uproot the biblical commandment that lamb is permissible to eat. Understand my example? So God defines what is clean and unclean. Man can't change God's definition, but man does have permission to come along and augment or create his own preference, as long as it's not contradictory to what God says. So Hegg continues, therefore, any meat declared edible by God should not be ruled unclean by man. And when we're talking about unclean, so if God says it's clean, and lamb is clean, calf or beef is clean, but pork is unclean, well then man has no right to swap those and reverse those and say that pork is clean and lamb is unclean. Man doesn't have the right to do that. Only God can change those definitions if he desired to. And as far as I can tell, anywhere in the Bible, there aren't any verses that outline God changing his mind. So far, we haven't seen anything yet. When Yeshua comes back, if he decides to declare a new Torah to Israel, well, then we'll have to deal with that when Messiah comes. He has that authority. But as far as I can tell, he hasn't done it. God hasn't done it. It's not going to happen. Hasn't happened yet, and I don't think it's going to happen when Messiah returns. But that's the general gist of what we're looking at so far. However, and we're going to play with this word clean and unclean in the Hebrew and the Greek here in a moment, but let me read Hegg first. Hegg says, it's on this basis about God's authority versus man's preferences. It's on this basis that Paul emphatically declares that nothing is unclean in and of itself. Now, here we're going to have to start playing with the words clean and unclean. In the Hebrew, when God declares animals as clean or unclean, he's speaking to the design that he created and the intrinsic nature and behavior of the animal as observable from Israel's standards. So God says to Israel, look at these particular animals. They either have certain characteristics in them. I created them this way, God would go on to say. They have split hooves, or they don't have a split hoof. They chew their cud, or they don't chew their cud. They have fins and scales, or they lack fins and scales, etc., etc. Certain birds are birds of prey, or they aren't birds of prey. They're domesticated type birds. They crawl on all fours, or they have jointed legs and they can leap off the ground. If you go back and read through Leviticus 11, you'll understand what I'm referring to. So, for God to declare to Israel what animals are permissible for eating and not eating, that is something that God established, and the animals haven't changed. Therefore, evolution, quote unquote, I'm using air quotes with my fingers. Evolution hasn't changed the nature of the characteristics of the animals that God said are not permissible to eat. Suddenly, evolution has stepped in and wiped out those distinctives, so that God has been made a fool. Nope, hasn't happened. Evolution hasn't changed. If you look at a pig today, he still has a split hoof. You look at certain fish, like, say, a catfish, he still doesn't have scales. Sharks still don't have scales. They have fins, but they don't have scales. And octopus have neither fins nor scales. Neither do shrimp. So, or lobsters. So, therefore, it's easy for us to look at the same animals that God described in Leviticus 3,500 years ago, and look at those same animals today and draw the same inference that God gave to Moses that long ago with today's animals. If God said it was unclean 3,500 years ago, those same animals have those same characteristics because evolution hasn't wiped out those characteristics. Sorry, evolution. And therefore, we have the same declaration that's applicable. Paul emphatically declares, however, that nothing is unclean in and of itself. What does this mean? Well, from the broader general biblical perspective, it could mean, there's a possibility of meanings here, but it could mean that until God comes along to declare something off list, then in and of itself, the animal isn't really clean or unclean. It's only in the context of ritual use that it's being declared clean or unclean. Israel's being set aside as a nation of priests unto God. Therefore, the context of service to God renders certain animals off the list. That could be one way to understand this. However, and that's based on working through the Hebrew definitions of clean and unclean. However, what we learned, and I'll put a little, flash a little chart on the screen afterwards in post-production. Sorry for you guys in my live study, you're not going to be able to see this. But what we learned by looking at the Greek that is relevant to our discussion is that by the time we got to Paul's day, and there were a lot of Greek-speaking Jewish people, we had two Greek words for the English term unclean. One of those Greek words, kathartos, was rooted in the intrinsic nature of an animal, such as the pig or the lobster or the octopus or something, a fish without fins and scales. It was rooted in defining something that was biblically off limits from eating. Unclean, a kathartos. This was the Greek counterpart to the original Hebrew word. But there was another Greek word called koinos that was brought into discussions on food that is sometimes rendered in your Bible as unclean, but the better definition is handled by everyone, common or unsanctified. And this definition doesn't necessarily speak to the intrinsic nature of the food or the animal, so much as it speaks to man's additional description of food that may have been sold in a questionable marketplace from a Hebrew perspective, from a Jewish perspective. So again, think of my example. You have permissible food like lamb that is used in an idolatrous ceremony, a pagan ceremony, and then it's sold in the Greek or Gentile marketplace. Is your average religious Jew in Paul's day going to purchase that lamb? Probably not. Why not, you ask? Well, I mean, it is permissible from God's list. It's on God's list. It's got the thumbs up, green check mark. However, it is of questionable origin and use because of its association with idolatry, because of its association with people who aren't keeping a scrupulous diet from a religious Jewish perspective. Thus, your average religious Jew is going to avoid that cut of meat sold in that common marketplace. He's going to label that piece of lamb, you ready for it? Koinos. Common, which is rendered unclean in some versions of your Bibles. And that's where a little bit of confusion lies. That lamb is going to be labeled as koinos by his particular standard. What is the religious Jew going to do? He's going to go to your kosher butcher and purchase his meat from there, where he knows the lamb was not used in an idolatrous ceremony, and he knows it wasn't handled by everyone who didn't have ritually clean hands to begin with, things like that. They didn't offer the food up to any particular gods. He knows it's not unsanctified meat. Therefore, his conscience is fine. It's okay. It's clear to buy that meat. Paul declares that nothing's unclean in and of itself. This could mean, again, there are more than one definition that are at play here, or more than one possibility. I'm just giving you the option that Tim Haig's giving to us and the option that I think is also a very good fit for the context. Paul comes along and says nothing's unclean in and of itself. Could Paul mean that the Leviticus list has been done away with? Is that what Hagg's trying to convey? Is that what Paul's trying to convey? Paul could mean that the dietary list has been being relaxed and lifted in Messiah, and that all things are clean, and that you no longer have to make a difference between pork and shellfish and shrimp and lobster and ham versus lamb and beef and chicken and things like that. That could be what Paul means when he says all things are clean, using the Greek word katharos. But that's unlikely given the nature of Paul's lifestyle and his admittance to being a lifelong Torah keeper, and the fact that he sought to dispel rumors that he was tearing down the law of Moses and doing away with circumcision and things like that. He went to great pains to teach the opposite, right, and explain the opposite, that he is still a law keeper, and that he is loyal to the Torah that God handed down through Moses and things like that. So that's probably not what he means when he says all things are clean. Instead, if we just go back to that context of him talking about man coming along, recognizing that God does have a list of what's edible and what's not edible, and yet man has a right to come along and say, well, if we pass certain animal meats through certain markets or temples and things like that, then they can be rendered off limits. In other words, the animal itself is innocent, clean, until a man comes along and declares otherwise. So let's see if Tim Hegg agrees with that definition that I'm talking about. Hegg says, that is, if God has declared it clean and therefore edible, it should not be otherwise considered. In other words, we shouldn't say that it's unclean. So let's say in Paul's day, you have a religious Jew who knows that meat was sold in the marketplace, and the common marketplace, not a Jewish kosher butcher, but it was sold in the common Greek marketplace of his day. A religious Jew in Paul's day is likely to turn his nose up at that cut of meat, particularly if it's, say, lamb, use my example. He's likely to say no, because in his mind, it's common. It's off limits. It's got a measure of unsanctified use because of it being handled by everyone. It's koinos, the Greek word, which is better rendered common, but unfortunately some Bibles show up as unclean, which really makes things confusing. But Paul says, from a religious Jew's perspective, if that's your halakha, okay, I can respect that as a Jew myself. I'm speaking as if I'm Paul. However, your Greek Christians, your Gentile Christians who weren't raised in a Jewish environment, if that meat is permissible by God's Leviticus standard, then even though it was sold in the common marketplace, they don't have to turn their nose away just because it came from a non-kosher butcher. It's still permissible by God's standard. It's got the green light. It's got the thumbs up. It's got a green check mark on it from God's perspective, meaning it's a permissible animal. Yes, it was sold in a questionable supermarket from a Jewish religious perspective, but that doesn't have to carry over to the Gentile side of the house and the side of the discussion. Your Gentiles could still purchase that cut of meat. If God declared it clean, then it should not be otherwise considered, meaning considered as unclean. That's what Hegg's trying to say. Gentiles, you guys are safe to eat that meat. God says it's okay to eat it, so it's fine. As long as, Paul, I'm kind of fast forwarding to the book of Corinthians for a second, particularly chapters 8, 9, and 10. As long as you are not actively, as Gentile Christians, participating in idolatrous ceremonies itself, and then knowingly partaking of meat that you knew without a shadow of a doubt was used in a pagan ceremony, then otherwise, if you're just buying it from your average Gentile supermarket, then otherwise it's okay to eat that meat. As long as you don't have some heavy-duty knowledge that it was, used in a pagan ceremony and your conscience is going to restrict you. Generally speaking to the general consensus at Rome, your Gentile population, the ones who profess belief in Jesus, go ahead and eat that meat if it's sold in the marketplace. He even goes on to say that eat what's sold in the market without raising questions of conscience. I think I'm paraphrasing something he mentions in Corinthians. So that's going to be the context that's going to help the Roman communities kind of fit a little more closely with their Jewish religious counterparts in this particular section of the letter. Let's continue reading through Hegg and see if this makes any sense. That is, Hegg says, this viewpoint is correct, will be seen in verse 20 where Paul includes the word food. When he says, all things are clean, he doesn't mean that, say, pagan practices are clean. He doesn't suddenly mean that idolatry is clean. He certainly doesn't mean that prostitution is clean or all of those other sins and vices that Gentiles are told to steer clear of. He doesn't mean everything is clean. The context is still food, and that's what we're talking about, and that's why Hegg mentions that. So look at what he says in verse 20, right? It's 19 and 20 and 21 that all kind of fit together there. Do not tear down the work of God for the sake of food. And so food in verse 21 that he's quoting here is attached to, I think it's verse 20. I think that might be verse 21 there. But all things are indeed clean. The things that Paul has in mind are the food. So that's the context. Paul's point, Hegg concludes, must be that everything that qualifies as food, i.e. everything God permits to be eaten, is indeed clean or is indeed innocent. It's ready to be handled by someone who's ready to say, okay, I can use this for all-purpose eating and cooking and recipes and things like that. As long as God says it's permissible, then we don't need to fight and tear at each other's throats, saying, nope, God says it's clean, but I say it's unclean. But no. God says it's clean, but I say it's clean. So we have some friction there. This seems to be the issue that was plaguing at least these particular Roman communities. So let me say it in my commentary this way. These are my own words. Again, just to be absolutely clear, I maintain that sha'ul is not teaching us that the dietary list of Leviticus 11 has been discarded. This, again, is the popular Christian perspective by today's Bible teaching standards. If you read through commentary after commentary on the book of Romans, and you get to Romans chapter 14 and read verse 19 and 20 and 21, indeed most of the chapter, you listen to your average pastor explain it to you, or you pop into a seminary and peek into the professor's notes, or you go online and Google search these particular verses and what they mean. The majority of commentaries are going to tell you Paul is telling the Roman Gentiles that they don't have to keep clean according to the Bible that was handed to Moses. God has done away with those dietary restrictions in Messiah. He's lifted the restrictions based on the fact that Messiah has cleansed all food. Again, going back to the Mark 7 passage, rendering from many Bible translations, thus he declared all foods clean, or something like that. It's not what goes into a man that defiles him, but what comes out of a man. Thus he declared all foods clean. You guys are familiar with the passage in Mark 7. I think it's like 7:19 or something like that. I can't remember off the top of my head exactly which verse it is. But the point being, this is the traditional Christian interpretation of what Paul is giving us here in Romans. And I believe that this is a disservice to Paul's testimony as a Messianic Jew. It's a disservice to the long-standing applicability of the law of Moses in the communities of Paul's day, particularly the establishment of God's word as the standard of holiness and righteousness, and what was deemed right and wrong, black and white, sin and righteousness, holiness. The law of Moses was that standard. The Bible that Paul carried didn't include a New Testament. That's the whole thing. That's the whole the reality that we have to come to face with, that we have to come to grips with in our 21st century discussions on this matter. And I'm gonna draw our study to a close tonight with these statements. We'll pick this up again next week. We'll just start with this paragraph here. Paul is not likely telling the Gentile Christians that you can eat everything, have a ham sandwich and get over it. Don't worry about it. He's not telling he's not even really telling the Jews, the religious Jews, hey, God lifted the dietary restrictions. Everything is clean. Nothing's unclean anymore. Pork is not unclean. Shrimp is not unclean. Eat whatever you want. Don't worry about it. Jesus cleansed it. The laws have been done away with. We're not under the law. We're under grace. That popular opinion doesn't really line up with Paul's own admission to keeping Torah his whole life and to establishing Torah and the obedience of faith among the Gentiles that he talks about in his letters. It also doesn't fit with Moses speaking of the continuing validity of his own words all throughout the letters of Moses, right? All throughout the books that Moses laid down. If you read through them, there doesn't seem to be an indication that someone's going to come along later on and uplift those or do away with them. Any Messiah figure is not going to come along and disrupt them. And then finally, and I'll close with this, we have the words of the Master himself. If you can't trust Moses, because he's a man, if you can't trust Paul, because he's a man, and if you can't agree to what I'm saying because I'm a man, at least listen and believe with what the Master himself said, because he's more than a man. He's very God himself. And what did he say in the book of Matthew, chapter 5, starting at verse 17 and going through verse 20? I didn't come to do away with the law of Moses. I'm not going to do away with it. I'm going to fulfill it. And that word fulfill is likely rooted in a definition that includes establishing, strengthening, correctly interpreting the law of Moses, bringing it to its proper foundation among God's people, and giving you the strength by the power of the Holy Spirit to implement God's words and God's ways so that you can walk them out and actually fulfill the righteous requirement of the Torah as you live and walk according to the Spirit and not according to the flesh. How do I know that that's the proper definition of the words fulfill by the Master? Because Paul gives us that definition in Romans chapter 8, the first, say, 10 verses or so. Go back and read it on your own, your homework assignment this week. Paul brings the definition of the fulfilling of Torah and the walking according to the Spirit into his letter here in the book of Romans. So with that, let's draw our study to a close. We'll pick this up again next week. Yes, it's a bit controversial by today's Christian standards to suppose that Paul's not relaxing the dietary list, that he actually does want the Gentile Christians to keep kosher according to the law of Moses, but he understands that there's going to be some friction because of the inclusion of Gentiles into the faith community at Israel's level, and the differences of understanding of meat sold in common marketplaces, meat offered up to idols and used in idolatrous ceremonies, and how do we fit that in with the fact that God didn't change the dietary list, but at the same time, we've got to allow people to have some slight differences when it comes to the origins of food. How can we get together without fighting one another and tearing one another down? That's what we're having a discussion on. And that'll do it for Romans 14 Unplugged, Feast and Fast and Food. Oh my.